This is this is Reverend Karen Brammer. I'm a UU minister. I work with the Green Sanctuary Program and as the Senior Associate for Climate Justice for the Unitarian Universalist Association. And Allie and I have been collaborating in this Environmental Justice Practitioners Network for a couple of years now to build a sense of direct learning in community to deepen our understanding of that intersection between the oppressions of race, class, and environment. And so I am so honored to introduce Paula. You can read in Justice on Earth the introduction or the bio for Paula. She has many, many credits to her name, but I want to tell you that Paula has been a mentor, whether or not she knows that, but a mentor to me for more than a decade. Oh, much more than a decade. When I first started working on congregational life staff for the Unitarian Universalist Association, Paula came to do an anti-racism workshop for our small team, and it was a profound experience that moved us all. And in that weekend or whatever chunk of time we had where we were working together, Paul and I just happened to have a conversation about whales. I think maybe because I was on my way to a whale watch, or she was. And from then, I felt this special connection. But then Paula, in different meetings with Unitarian Universalist staff, has been a gentle and strong presence to remind me of the intersectionality, because at different times I have thought about doing green work that assumed that everybody contributed to carbon pollutants equally, and inviting everybody to equally try to approach that. And I don't know if, Paula, you remember that moment, but it certainly affected me. So you are a personal mentor to me, Paula, and I'm so grateful that you're here tonight to ground us all in the historic moments that brought together what we're calling the environmental movement, or the eco movement, or the climate justice movement, that all comes from the same root. And so I will stop talking, and again, thank you, Paula. And if you'd like to start us with a reading, I would be most grateful.
I will. I hope you have your ink pens out and a piece of paper close by. So before I actually give you the reading, I am going to give you the resource. And this reading is from a book called Ghost Fishing, Eco Justice Anthology. An anthology of poetry. So you will want to have this in your collection. The editor is Melissa Tuckey, Tuckey. And it's a pretty new publication. The poem that I will read to you is written by Everett Hoagland. That's Hoagland. He is a longtime Unitarian Universalist and a contemporary poet. The name of this is Invocation. Architect of icebergs, snowflakes, crystals, rainbows, sand grains, dust motes, atoms. Mason, whose tools are glaciers, rain, rivers, ocean. Chemist who made blood of seawater, bone of minerals and stone, milk of love. Whatever you are, I know this. Spinner, you are everywhere, in all the ever-changing above, whirling around us, yes, in the loose strands, in the rough weave of the common thread cloth, threaded with our DNA on the hubbed spoke spinning wheel that is this world, solar system, galaxy, universe. Help us to see ourselves in all creation and all creation in ourselves, ourselves in one another. Remind those of us who like connections made with similes, metaphors, symbols. All of us are, everything is already connected. Remind us, as the oceans go, so go we. As the air goes, so go we. As other life forms on earth go, so go we. As our planet goes, so go we. Great poet who inspired in the beginning was the word. Edit our thought so that our ethics are our politics and our actions, the afterlives of our words. Thank you very much. I hope that you will get the book and share this poem and others widely as you move around and do your work. Well, it's good to be here. And of course, we all know that this is show and tell. We are here. Oh, it's backwards. Because of the publication of Justice on Earth. I know there have been a few other authors who have also presented webinars. This is a book that came out of a 2015 Environmental Justice Collaboratory that was an innovative approach to Unitarian Universalist Environmental our movement, and it was held in Detroit, Michigan. It was interesting visiting Detroit. It looked like a war zone, really. There were so many abandoned buildings, just blocks of abandoned buildings, abandoned factories. It was quite stunning to be there in a city and see the aftermath of really the economic situation there. But there was, often in the face of crisis, we find new hope. And Detroit had found new hope. We got to meet with activists in the city who were rebuilding. It was almost seemed like an underground movement taking place. And one of the things that they said that just stuck with me is everyone mattered. And it didn't matter if you were talking about someone with disabilities or with developmental delays. Every story they told, everyone mattered. And they were about the business of building a new community in the rubble of the economic crisis there. So that had a great impact on us. I was also quite excited about their goal of food sovereignty. And I've never been in a place where you could see stores with hydroponic stores, like a number of them throughout. And I have a science and agriculture, my background is science and agriculture, plant sciences. And so that really stuck with me. And we were able to get this publication done through Skinner House Books. And I was asked to write a history of the environmental justice movement. Now, let me say, that was such a daunting task that it almost paralyzed me, because the more you read, the more you know that you don't know, the more there is to know. And so it wasn't until I could let go of the idea of writing a history and just look at a reflection on the history, because I only had like 2,500 words to write. So a reflection on the history of the environmental justice movement, and then I felt free to write in my own voice. I happen to also be married to, my husband is a marine biologist. He got his PhD from Georgetown University. He studied as a Fulbright scholar in Australia. We both are scuba divers, and my daughter studies social and cultural history. So any which way I looked at it, the subject matter is so vast that, it's fun to immerse yourself in the reading and the research and the study, but at some point you have to come up for air and distill it into a message that other people can gather. And so somehow I managed, but it really didn't happen until I switched and looked at this as a reflection, so I could speak about it from a place that I knew and was comfortable. So I'm going to ask if Karen or Allie can put up, I have a one-slide PowerPoint. How about that? I'm not going to PowerPoint you tonight, but we have one image for you to see. So a friend of mine got this copy of the New Yorker, and put it in a lovely frame. And she said, when I saw this, it just reminded me so much of you. And I was grateful for it. And the first time I was going out to talk about the chapter in the book, I said, let me take this with me. Because if people do not understand the significance of the symbolism here, it's pretty hard to understand the environmental justice movement. And let me see if you can switch it back to all of us in the space together. So I want to ask the question first. Do you all understand what I mean by that? Give me a head nod or a thumbs up or a no. Okay, so we need a little explanation. The circumstances that I think we were all glued to our Facebook and TV and news and whatnot. As the country, local communities, where it became national news. I want to go back to 2012 and the shooting of Trayvon Martin that we all remember. And that managed to find its way to become national news. There's so many things that happen at the local level that basically go unnoticed or unaddressed on a larger scale. Let's fast forward from Trayvon Martin to 2004 and the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And by that time, I'm sure most of us were paying attention, and the Black Lives Matter took off. It found its voice and its image following Michael Brown's murder. And then we can even move, so the image that you just saw is really of a divided country. There's a white America and there's a Black America. And so that was so powerful because the St. Louis Arch, which is stunning if you catch it at the right moment as the light gleams off of it, but it was symbolic for what was happening in Missouri at that time around the police brutality. And essentially, the way that this country treats, responds to, ignores, includes or does not include African Americans and people of color is critical to every aspect of life. And, the Flint water crisis also came about. And for all of these things, you can look at not just the history of that moment in that local community, but also the history of racial justice or injustice, economic development, economic injustice or justice. And you need to look at those things to get the story. So I'm going to ask you to, if you have your pens out, there are 4 things I want you to note. The first is environment. And we can use an acronym I used to work for the Department of Agriculture with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And we had an acronym in the Department of Agriculture called SWAPA, SWAPA. And it stands for soil, water, air, plants, and animals. And that was our approach to environment, covered all aspects of the environment. The second piece I'd like for you to write is the public, citizens, and communities. So we're really looking at groups of people. Then the third is public policy and politics. And the fourth is the economics or the economic systems and corporations. So the issues around environmental justice always have all 4 of these aspects in play. You can't understand one without having knowledge of the others. There's the interaction, the interplay, the constant push and pull of all of these things working together. When we're talking about the environment and our communities, we're really looking at how do we have sustainable, healthy places to live. And we look at public policy and politics, it matters who is at the table. And then, of course, corporations, they talk about we're in a culture war. We have been in a culture war for a long time, and I think the culture war can be framed in terms of the citizens of this country and the corporations, and where the power lies and who is impacted by what decisions. So another thing that, how, as I mentioned, you go through and then all of a sudden it's like something just pops in and you get this moment of clarity. I think I was in an anti-racism training probably in the past month or so. And it dawned on me that the origin of most oppressions, I think, can be traced back to land. So here we are talking about environmental movement, environmental justice, climate justice. Most oppressions, I think, can be traced back to the origin of oppressions, can be traced back to the land and the resources and power and colonization in terms of who has the right to own and to utilize those resources of that land. You think about it all over the world, our racism, I want to own it that way, but racism in this country and global racism all goes back to the land and the resources, right? So the environment, really, if you're doing anti-oppression work, it should lead you back to the environment eventually. And also, I think that we can look at environmental justice in this country as a continuation of our civil rights movement. movements are so important because it takes a while for people to find that commonality in an issue and to grow their numbers largely enough until they have a voice, and a voice that can be raised at a level high enough to finally be heard, or where people begin to pay attention. If we look at what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, it really wasn't until groups of people were out in the streets, right, stopping traffic, that folks started to really pay attention. It became significant. Remember the 99% movement? The same thing. It happens in numbers. And so, we have to work at movements to the Poor People's Campaign that's happening right now. I hope it continues to grow and that it's very successful. But we need people who have common interests, who come together and say, no, this injustice must stop. And then we get involved in a movement. It's interesting that because Joe Madison was one of the classic civil rights organizers, movement builders, he says the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. If there is no sacrifice, it won't become a movement. So that's something to remember as well. But our movements are really when we find those points of solidarity and we are engaged in our shared humanity and the problems that will cause risk to us, and we can demand change of people who hold the power to make those decisions. Often our elected officials, but it may be that our elected officials end up really being more mediaries in this cultural challenge. So mediaries between the community and the corporations. Think about that, right? Especially as it relates to not just the environment, almost everything. There's so many things where our elected officials are the ones who they're major gatekeepers. They can either look out for our interests or look out for the corporate interests and throw us under the bus, so to speak, right, for the benefits of corporations and profits. So it matters tremendously who is at the table, and then that connects the environmental movement to many of the other social justice movements that happen at the local level. In fact, the Voters' Rights Act was critical in us being able to move toward the environmental justice movement. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But when we build a movement, basically, we are saying that we are going to help to shape the agenda instead of it just being done to us, instead of us just being passive. We are demanding our seat at the table one way or another. With the environmental justice movement, it really was the daughter of the civil rights movement. I love to think of it that way because we had to have the success of the civil rights movement because that taught us what to do next. That taught us how to do movement building. And it also gave us the legislative basis for demanding equal protection under the law, which was written into the civil rights movement. There are three cases, I think, that help us to really understand how that movement evolved. Of course, there have been things for years all over the country happening as it relates to the environment. And the agency that I used to work with was born out of the Dust Bowl. So we were in a period in the country where our land was cleared, it was overgrazed, we were over farming, depleting the soil and not giving back the nourishment and life that was needed for us to continue to have productive crops. Also, along with that, you clear the land, you get winds, it blows and displaces the soil, you get rain and you get runoff, and the soil just moves from one location to another and eventually ends up in your water. So we were really having an environmental crisis in this country. State, local, and federal government got together to do something about it. And they formed a partnership. And from that partnership, this is in the 1930s, 1930 to 1960. In 1935, the Soil Conservation Service was born in the federal government, and as a result of this partnership. And that's the agency I worked with. They changed their name to Natural Resource Conservation eventually. But so we start with the Dust Bowl, which was the biggest environmental crisis that we had in the country. That could have been the beginning of our environmental movement, but it didn't happen that way. And when I look at it, I think in part because the action was driven by government instead of driven by grassroots, right? So in looking at that, I think you actually have to have the engagement of citizens pushing against those who are in power to really build a movement. And I didn't realize that until taking a closer look at this. The other thing that happened was the country went into the Great Depression, or we were in the Great Depression. And because of that, I think that that stunted our ability to build a movement because people were in such crisis. When you get in crisis, you're in survival mode. And so the movement did not happen then. Following the Great Depression, the country goes into World War II. In fact, some people say that World War II ended the Depression. Some people argue against it, but it seems logical to me that all of the industries that grew up in part around the war, and then following the war back in this country, we had the baby boom, right? Many of you are probably baby boomers. But we also had a tremendous economic boom in this country, which sounds like a good thing. But I think about it almost like, when a business grows too fast and it doesn't have the infrastructure for it, it can do harm, but it can also destroy itself because it grows faster than it has the ability to manage. Well, I think in our country, the industry grew faster than we could manage, and we didn't have the infrastructure for it, and the environment took the hit. And you think about it, after the Dust Bowl and that great environmental crisis, you would have thought that we maybe could have foreseen some of the environmental issues, but we didn't. And maybe it's because we had moved from an agriculture society to an industrial society at that time, and we didn't really know what the impact of that would be. But just the same, the country, our land and our communities suffered. Our waterways suffered during that time. That was 1939 to 1945, World War II. We started paying, and a lot of what I looked at was really at the federal level. One, that's the news that we all hear, but also having worked in federal government and being a little closer to that. But in 1962, Rachel Carson, of course, wrote Silent Spring. And is interesting because she managed to get the attention of John F. Kennedy. And the work that she was doing was they were paying attention. I understand that Kennedy bought books of hers, of Silent Spring, and gave it to staff, and staff were reading it. And the federal government, or at least the Kennedy's administration, got behind her work and started using her work to make the case for putting regulations in place. And another interesting piece, now, of course, Rachel Carson is often embraced as a Unitarian Universalist. I'm not sure that she ever was actually a member, but she's very closely affiliated with Unitarian Universalists and even with some of the churches in the DC area. But in one account I read, she actually had cancer while she was on the floor of Congress testifying, making the argument about regulating some of these pollutants that were being put into the environment, and they were showing up in our food. So she's given credit by many, maybe not by all, but by many, and certainly by me, as being the person who helped to launch the modern environmental movement. Now, notice I make a distinction between the environmental movement and the environmental justice movement, all right? So we have in the early 60s, Rachel Carson's work and the Kennedy administration starting to regulate some of the environmental issues. Then in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, you know that story, or much of it, through great hardship, much demand, lots of violence, lots of resistance. Our own martyr, Jim Reeb, we get the passage of the Civil Rights Act under Johnson in '64. And then in the Voting Rights Act as well. In 1970, and the modern environmental movement is launched with Earth Day. Every one of these dates has years, they're years in the making before we finally get a date where something crystallizes and gets its title. But the environmental movement then, it gets crystallized with, in 1970. Now, mind you, I want to pause for a moment and say, we are at a moment, if we're smart about it and if we act quickly, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day is coming next year in 2020. So if people really wanted to get together and I'm sure a lot is being done and being organized, but you might want to look at what's happening locally in your area and pay attention to what's happening nationally so that this 50th anniversary gets marked in a significant way. And it's very, very important because this administration is undoing decades of work. And this would be the time, you know, we could have a moment like we had in 2017, right after the inauguration, with the women's movement all over the country and other parts of the world stood up and made their voices heard. That should happen in 2020 around the environmental issues. So Nixon was in office, but many of the environmental issues were being pushed by, I think at that point it was a predominantly Democratic Congress. Certainly Earth Day was the brainchild of Senator Gaylord Nelson, who was Democratic. And then let's fast forward now to these three cases that then lead up to the environmental justice movement. And I wanted to put them in this order because the first case, the Love Canal that everybody heard about, that one didn't have a racialized component, but it was economic. All right, so you had a community where people were sold land that was on top of a waste site, and the people who were buying, of course, were not aware of it, but people were getting sick, and they started seeing the hazardous waste that was underground started to surface in people's homes, in the basements, started coming up through the ground. There was an elementary school was built on top of the dump site, and people were getting sick, women were having miscarriages, babies were being born with deformities, but it took the grassroots movement to organize and demand, and not only that, they also had to prove. They had to present their own evidence that they were being poisoned. Look at what it takes for us to get action. The good news is that Jimmy Carter's administration responded. Now, this is very significant because I talked about Kennedy's response. Jimmy Carter's response. We have Clinton responding. It matters so much who is in office, not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level too. If we're going to protect our communities, if we're going to do environmental and climate justice, we have to elect people who have an accountability to the communities over the corporations. And it seems to almost always be, it's almost always shifts when the parties shift in office. And for the most part, you know, we get this information in the news over time. It's hard to connect all of those dots, but we need to start to teach people how important it is in terms of what the parties support. So the Love Canal, Jimmy Carter's administration, they come up with money. They moved 800 families to another community. But maybe even more important, well, not more important, just as important. So we don't get justice without building the structure, right? There have to be structural changes to sustain a change. And what the Carter administration did was pass the Superfund Act, which required companies, especially petroleum companies, to put a percentage of money aside in like an escrow account. There's a federal escrow account to help with the cleanup of sites like the Love Canal. And that came as a result of that crisis. Lois Gibbs is a name to remember, and her story, their story, was on TV in a movie. So that was the first big case, I think, where the federal government responded to the environmental justice issue, and that one was about economics. And then the next big case was in the 1990s. Well, I'm sorry, not in the 1990s. I got my dates wrong. And was that the? Oh, hold on for a second. I want to give you the right date on that. But it followed the Love Canal, and I think each time we get a gain, people start to see how they might act differently, or what they can demand, what they can ask for. And so this was 1979, was the next case. It was called Bean versus Southwestern Management. And they used, this happened in Houston, Texas. It was an African-American middle-class community where there was a proposal to build a a solid waste location, and the community was fighting it. Robert Bullard's wife was actually the person arguing the case, and he was a sociologist, and she asked him to gather some data. And what they found was it was something like maybe it was 6 out of 8 of the solid waste sites were located in Black communities. 6 out of 8. So again, they had to prove that they were being impacted. But the administration was a little closer to, I think a little. Well, this was a local case. It never went federal. They did get some support though, and but he made the case, and he used Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to argue the case for equal protection under the law. They didn't win their case, but it was an important trial case. I think a lot of times when things change, it's not the first attempt that leads to the change, but the first one. It's like when someone runs for office, a lot of times the first time they may not win, but that first one exposes a lot of people to them. So the next time their hat is in the ring, they have name recognition. Well, this first case in Houston, Texas, did make a difference, although they didn't win the case. The next case that came up is the one, well, not the next that came up, but the next case that I point to. I'm going to be careful not to assume that it's that narrow a track. The next case that I point to is 1982 in Warren County. Now, let me go back to Houston, Texas for a moment. They found that over a 50-year period, the 6 out of 8 city-owned incinerators were in Black communities. So they were looking from 1930 to 1978. And a book that you can find a lot of information on it, but Robert Bullard wrote the book Dumping in Dixie, and that was published in 1990. So 1978 to 1982 was this period where Warren County in North Carolina had a situation that there were, prior to that, there was a company that had just been dumping PCBs at night along the highway, on the grassy area of the highway. And that had been taking place for years. It was illegal dumping. And it was demanded that they clean it up. And what North Carolina did was decided to put the landfill, which was really a hazardous waste site, in the poorest Black community. And there you have it again. I mean, these are people who are not at the table when these decisions are being made, these decisions that impact them. And it's not only a health issue, which of course it is. And in Warren County, you're talking about the dangers to the groundwater supply. But it's not just a health issue, but it's an already poor community that's land value, and their land value goes down. I mean, it's further devalued because it's used as a waste site. But so the company was required to clean up all of that contaminated soil. And the decision was made to put this landfill in Warren County, and people tried to fight it for a long time. So you may have seen in the book, 10,000 truckloads of soil were being brought to be dumped there. Now, having learned from the civil rights movement, and probably having learned also from the case in Houston, Texas, they started protesting to block the trucks from coming in. And you had the big high-profile people coming in, Walter Fauntleroy, Joseph Lowery, people who were big from the civil rights movement. A lot of people got arrested during that time, including Walter Fauntleroy. Those kinds of things make the news. So remember, Joe Madison said a movement is about sacrifice. If there's no sacrifice, there's no movement. The people sacrificed. They put themselves on the line, the civil disobedience. And they got attention. They weren't able to stop the landfill, but they launched the movement. And that was the beginning of the environmental justice movement in name. And it has grown from there. Churches have been a part of it. And in 1987, the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, they released a report called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. And this was the first report to show that race was the most important factor in determining where these toxic waste sites were located. And in 1993, the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina provided money. They gave a grant to pay for the investigation about that particular landfill to establish whether or not it was toxic. And so there are times when denominations and when churches, which really, the church is the community, right? The people in the community are the ones who are going to the churches. And so that ends up being a place where we can organize and try to protect our rights when our rights are being violated by the people in power. There were conferences that were held. They started bringing people together. And in 1990, there was a conference on race and the incidence of environmental hazards that was held at the University of Michigan. Also in 1990, the EPA met with the Congressional Black Caucus to look at forming what was called an environmental equity group. And they also published a report. In 1991, the first National People of Color Environmental Justice Leadership Summit was held in Michigan. And in 1992, now this is very significant, Congressman John Lewis, so you have to listen to the names. So remember, let's go back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which started creating more opportunities for people of color to vote their interests. We started to get a few more people of color in office. Walter Fauntleroy, he was the Washington, D.C. representative. I remember when he was elected to office. So when you have somebody at the table, they may not have enough power to make the change, but they do have a voice that can help to influence. And so in 1992, John Lewis and Vice President Al Gore proposed the Environmental Justice Act. It didn't pass. And in 1993, they rewrote it and it didn't pass again. And so in 1994, Bill Clinton issued an executive order. And that was for his administration to form the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And then also they required all of the agencies to have a strategic plan for environmental justice. I happened to be working during that time, and I was asked to facilitate the development of the strategic plan for my agency. Early in my time working at the national level, one of the first people I went to hear a lecture was Robert Bullard, who was the sociologist on the Houston case. And what was interesting for me, I heard him, and I also heard Bynum, I'm sorry, I don't have his name on the tip of my tongue, but another man who was doing the work in Michigan. But they said something that, I had a science background. They said something that just changed the way that I think about a lot of things around science and social justice. So they said, they kept being told you have to use the scientific method. And they said, but we're looking at the impact. We see children in communities that are suffering from these environmental conditions. To go through all, right? You hear me? I see some faces. To go through all of what academia is requiring means to let these problems persist while we try to satisfy something that may or may not even be effective at bringing about change. And that was, for me, just this major shift in how we look at and start to think about all of our social justice issues. We need to be looking at the impact and not just looking at, they say you can't dismantle the master's house using his tools, right? So that was one of those situations. It's like, we can't make the changes if the only rules that we're using are the ones that are protecting the status quo, essentially. And so we really need people to push in other areas in ways where we are responding to the human needs and the environmental needs on the ground. And with that, I want to hold. I think I took a little longer than I thought I would. But let's hold right there. And Allie and Karen, do you want to do the opening for questions? By the way, before you do, let me say one more thing, because the administrations are so important. President Obama's administration was bringing things back online during the George Bush administration. They had neglected all of this. And they said that the environmental justice, even though these committees were formed, the council was formed, they said it's not an affirmative action project.
Wow.
So they took the focus off of race and off of economic justice. You have to pay attention to who's in office. When the Republicans are in office, they ignore this work. When the Democrats are in office, they push for it. They're listening to the people more, maybe not as much as we need, but there's a much better chance of action being taken during the Democratic administrations. And I'll stop there.
I'm very moved, and my head is swarming with images and questions. And I'm thinking that there may be a few people who are ready to ask questions and others who need a little bit more time. So why don't we assume that as you're ready to ask a question, you can, I was going to say raise your hand, but I don't see that function at the moment. So indicate either by waving to us or by sending I see Alice just said hand. Does that mean, Alice, that you're just suggesting that people send into the chat?
I think it means Alice has something to say.
That's what I'm saying. The hand is a way that we can do it. So go for it, Alice.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks, Allie.
Hey, hi.
Hey, Paula. I'm learning a lot from this call. I'm sorry I had to jump in and out as I was commuting. I think one of the things that I struggle with, and I work at Greenpeace, a really large, big environmental organization, is kind of putting in this frame of justice into the work. And I recently watched a documentary on Charlottesville, and the one thing that really, really stood out to me was when they mentioned at the end that like one of the reasons these white supremacists are coming out in this way is because of fear of resources and lack of resources and where those resources are going to be. And I'm wondering how that will translate into the future as more and more we're going to have to learn, you're going to have to be compassionate and loving and, equitable. And yeah, that's just something that I'm really struggling with. And I'm really hoping to push in like my own organization, but like the framework isn't like quite there yet.
Yeah, there are a couple of links that were at the end of the chapter in the book, and one includes principles of environmental justice. So there are 17 principles that came out of that, and I'd encourage people to look at it, because Alice, this might give you something that you can use. When it comes to resources, so this goes back again to the difference in administrations. Under deregulation that started happening under the Reagan administration, and under the Bush administration, it was continued. So we have the struggle in the country around ownership and privatization, right, of so many aspects of our lives. And all the time, the corporations, the corporate class has continued to amass resources. So we're left looking at each other in terms of the scarcity, when if we were working together, we could really put call these companies into accountability. And we don't have a sustainable lifestyle, I believe, that we're doing so much extraction and so much production. We don't need all the stuff that we have. And we need to demand, or I don't know if it's probably demand, but there needs to be a different mindset or worldview around socially responsible companies. And somehow, so like with a movement, whether or not we organize ourselves to boycott companies that are polluting the environment, right, and support the ones that are doing something good. But I don't know if we have the kind of national organizing where we could really get enough people on board for those things to make a difference. We need a people's movement, and I think the Poor People's Campaign is maybe the best chance we have. The other side of it is we'll react when we have another crisis, but the crisis obviously has to be so big that so many people are suffering, or the land is suffering in such a way that we feel like we don't have any other choice. We need to move before that happens. Thank you. But the scarcity of resources, so, they're looking at people of color as being their threat. Their threat really are the people who have the billionaires and the corporations.
Paula, I have a question, and I guess I want to lead with just something that was on my mind during your talk, and that is that there are so many environmental injustice hotspots in the country now, and I was so ignorant of it growing up in like a corporate suburb type culture. And so for me, it wasn't until the Keystone Pipeline exposed the EJ communities in Houston to me in my own life. And I am wondering, I guess I hold the belief that everyone on the call isn't too far away from an environmental justice community. They're all over the place now. And what advice would you have to UUs who are just having an awakening about this issue, or an urge to do more in solidarity with this movement and those communities? Yeah.
So thank you. I am big on the concept of a community of communities. And I think that we need to learn to see ourselves as a community of communities, not just within the walls of our congregations, but also in our wider community. And so one, I would encourage you to look at your environmental justice work in your congregation and look at the 8th principle. Allie, will you show them that behind your back?
Sure.
Look at the 8th principle, which is about building a beloved community by dismantling racism and oppression in ourselves and in our institutions. So if you were to take that seriously, how would it affect your environmental justice work? So that's one piece to look at. Another is, I think that almost every community has, as you were saying, Allie, these environmental justice issues. Wherever you've got, I think wherever you have the power disparity, wherever you have it's not just economics and power. And so the power, we're talking about who's making the decisions. Wherever you have that kind of disparity, you probably also have some environmental justice issues. And the environmental justice is not just about what's happening to people of color, it's also what's happening to lower income communities. But find out what's going on historically in your area. Every one of these situations has a history. And those first 4 things that I asked you to look at, environment, SWAPA, remember that? The communities, public policy, and the economics of it. Every one of those environmental justice issues has all of these things at play. So find out what the history was. And you know, when you look at that, especially when you look at legislation or policy that has been passed, look and see who was in office when something was passed or when it failed, even in your local community. You know, I started doing this. I mean, you could spend years just studying that alone. But I think that you will start to see a big difference in the liberal or progressive candidates and those who are able to turn a blind eye to the community in favor of money. Take a look at what's happening in your local community. And I think that will be enough to alarm you and maybe help you to organize around it. Is that helpful?
I think so. I see some nods too. Laura has the next question.
And I would add to that, not only look at who's in office, but who's at the table when policy is being made. We're having a big argument here in Massachusetts where a guy that thinks he's the Armada from heaven coming down, that's been organized in the 60s and knows everything there is to do about it, but he gutted our environmental justice bill last session. It was going to pass, but he insisted that we take race and class and anything to do with income out of it because he wants all communities to be equal, and totally missed what the whole core and the whole purpose of it was. He's the Democrat. He's looked at as this leader in climate. I can't get UUs to pay attention to. He refuses to sit down with our environmental justice leaders. He thinks he knows more than the people that are in the communities who have direct impact. In Massachusetts, whether you have asthma, it's determined mainly by your zip code. And he doesn't want to hear that. So I would argue, don't get misled by people who get a lot of attention and look like they know what they're talking about and have all the pretty packaging. Look at who's sitting down at the table with that person and drafting that policy and drafting that legislation.
That's right. Are they accountable to the community? And what shows that? What proves that they are? Yeah, that's key. That's real key. And it's so easy for people to be, I want to say, bought off, or, to go for a decision without really revealing what motivates them to vote the way that they do. And with what you said, Laura, that's like the all lives matter thing, right? So it doesn't matter what happens to the communities that have the least power in the conversation and probably least represented. that someone knows better, right? We really have to get to, so democracy is not working that way. We've got some changes we've got to make. Which also says we need to be educating younger people early so that they grow up with a worldview that will allow them to raise the kinds of questions and critique what's happening so that they'll be better stewards than we have been. Yeah.
Paula, I have a question for you. This is Karen. A lot of the work that Allie and I are doing, both with Green Sanctuary and Ministry for Earth, now is picking up on the need for us to learn fast from each other, to not keep trying to reinvent something that's already been worked out, but to really exchange resources, inform each other, strengthen each other in connection and community as activists. So it's a combination of being strong presence in your locale and grounded in what's happening locally, but also somehow connecting on the larger and larger levels. Would you say something about that?
When you say connecting on the larger levels, you mean people who are doing similar work in other locations?
Yeah. So from locale to state to region to national, does that play in historically from your perspective? Or
Oh, absolutely it does, especially as you're growing a movement. If you take a look at the civil rights movement, it was happening in a lot of places at one time. Black Lives Matter was happening in a lot of places at one time, 99%, the same kind of thing. One thing I'm glad you asked that question, because I meant to ask you, are you all connecting with your state action networks or UU legislative ministries?
We're working on it, but I want to ask that question of people who are participating. We've got a couple of congregational groups and other UU activists here. Who wants to respond to that? Laurel has a hand.
Mute myself. Okay, I'm unmuted. And a week ago we had a UU Day at the legislature sponsored by Unitarian Universalist Justice Arizona. It's a separate 501c3. It's got its own board. It defines what it wants to focus on. And here in Arizona, water is a big issue. School is a big issue because Arizona has really gone big time for STO, student tuition vouchers, and it's getting bigger. And President Trump initiated legislation on the federal level about that. What that does is it sucks income it sucks money from the general budget and puts it into private schools and or public schools that are run by private corporations, so that private corporations are making money off tax dollars, and they can be more selective about their students, and that has a tendency to be a racial justice issue also.
Right. Can you say something about the coalitions that you're working in? Who are you connecting with in this effort?
Lisa Hutchins McDaniel is currently the employee of
The Action Network.
Yeah, of the UU Jazz.
Mm-hmm.
She's leaving in June, and I don't know who's going to take her place. But she pretty much facilitates all of the team meetings. I serve on the water team, and one of the big foci this year has been keeping rivers running in Arizona. Cabo Camari, Agua Fria, Little Colorado, the lesser rivers, not the big Colorado. Although that's been a point of contention also, what with Lake Mead dropping.
You were talking about the Action Network, and I want to just bring people's attention in the chat that Laura Wagner focused your attention on the State Action Network. You can find out who your local or your state action network is and what they're working on and how to connect with each other.
For instance,
and I'd imagine that many of the state action networks are probably connected to a coalition beyond themselves. So We have to do this work in coalition. We do not have the information that we need or the bandwidth to do it. And not only that, I think that the multicultural coalition is unbeatable. So, you know, if we try to go it alone, if we're going together and supporting people, there are people on the ground who are living day to day with these issues, who have been working at it, and we need to find out who they are and see how we can support each other.
If I may, right here in Arizona, one of the main multicultural facets of the water issue is that the Gila River Indian Nation has rights to water that it's gotten from white culture over a long period of time. And now Rusty Bowers is the Speaker of the House and wanted to take away those rights from the Gila River Indians in preference for the rural farmers. Well, if there's a rule that says if the rural farmers don't use the water for 5 years, it reverts to the Gila River Indian Nation. And he wanted to just say, no, that's not going to be. But finally got enough people used the right to speak, which is a process where you can send them notes on computer. You can send all the legislators in committee notes about what you think about things.
Laurel, thank you so much. It's really good to hear from Arizona, and I'm aware that some people are beginning to drop off because of time, and I want to make sure we give opportunities to other folks to check in. Gail is talking about Washington State. Gail, do you want to say more?
Jesse has a hand.
Oh, go ahead, Jesse. Jesse, are you able to unmute?
Yeah, just quickly, in Oregon, our state action network is supporting the Clean Energy Jobs Bill. And this is the second year that there's been a huge lobby day. And now that we've got a supermajority of Democrats in Congress, it looks for sure like it's going to pass, but it doesn't, we don't know what the details are because it's being negotiated after a series of public meetings. But that's one thing that our state action network has been doing.
Beautiful.
I think our state action networks and legislative ministries are an underutilized gem.
And unsung heroes.
Unsung heroes. And they really are the next logical step in any of our social justice work. How we change public policy. That's where they've been specializing. So we need to bring that together. And I would ask all of you to encourage people in your congregations to support, become members, to join your state action networks so that they can get stronger.
So Terry Lohman is talking about Iowa's state action network and problems with water. Terry's talking about, Gail's talking about Washington State, Faith Action Network and Earth Ministry, Allies for the Frontline Communities. Really exciting and important stuff here. Really important. I have a sense that we are not going to break into small groups, that we are going to just continue in this conversation for another couple minutes. You've got a lot of people saying thank you, Paula, as they need to drop off. This has been a powerful session, a lot of information garnered and getting people thinking about their locales. I'm wondering if we can center and do a closing reading and then continue to chat a wee bit if people want to stay on and ask a few more questions. Does that sound about right, given where we are?
Yeah.
I'm reading from Alicia Ford, who is now becoming the director of our International Unitarian Universalist office, who's worked in many capacities. And she writes, when we pause to remember who we are, companions on this grand experiment called life, when we take a moment to shed the ways we have been carefully taught, to lead from fear, to punish the poor, to persecute those who don't look like we do, to deny rights to those who love, to believe that we are separate, that some people are superior to others. When we take a moment to shed all of that and hear our stories, hear and see each other into existence, into community, when we take a moment to embrace, to practice a different way of being, when we answer the call of love, when we are living into the promise of building the world we dream about. It's beautiful to dream, to stretch our minds into the future, build a new way of being, not someday, beginning today, beginning again every day that we have breath, taking courage with these hands and hearts to make real the dream of a more equitable world, to journey together, seeking to be transformed even as we transform. That's Alicia Ford in Bill Singford's collection, To Wake, to Rise.